In a kingdom far, far away, there was once a girl who knew happiness. She lived in a small but warm home, surrounded by the scent of fresh bread and lavender. Her father, a kind and gentle merchant, would lift her onto his shoulders as they walked through the bustling streets of the kingdom, letting her reach for the sky. She would sit by the hearth at night, listening to his stories of adventure and faraway lands, dreaming of the day she might see them herself. Ella had a bright laugh that rang through the air, a heart unburdened by sorrow. She had friends in the village, children who ran through the fields with her, who held her hands as they leaped over streams. She had a mother once too, though her memory was soft, fading like a dream. But her father never let her feel alone. As long as he was there, she had love. She had safety. She had a future. But happiness is fragile, and childhood is fleeting. The first crack in her world came in whispers. The adults spoke in hushed tones about debts, about the king's insatiable greed. She didn't understand then. Not until the day her father came home with a shadow in his eyes, his hands trembling as he touched her cheek. Then came the summons. She remembered clinging to his arm as he was led away to the palace, promising her he would return. He did not. King Edric had destroyed him with one cruel decree, stripping him of his wealth and having him executed for failing to repay a debt he never truly owed. Ella had watched in horror as his body hung from the palace gates, and in that moment she saw a young boy laughing among the nobles. Prince Aldric, the heir to the throne, her father's murderous son. She was cast out soon after, sent to the doorstep of her father's widow, Lady Seraphina, a woman who had never wanted her. Once a cherished daughter, she was now a servant in her own home, renamed in mockery, Ashen Ella, for the soot that clung to her skin as she cleaned. But she never cried, she never begged, she endured. Then came the royal decree. The prince was seeking a bride. A grand ball would be held, and every eligible maiden was to attend. Ella's stepmother scoffed at the idea of Ella going, but Ella dared to hope. She spent weeks gathering scraps of fabric, stitching together a gown of soft blues and silvers. Nothing grand, but beautiful in her eyes. When the night arrived, she descended the stairs, her heart pounding. For a moment, she saw something unfamiliar in her stepfamily's faces. Surprise, even something close to admiration. But then Lisette laughed. Margot followed. Seraphina simply smirked. Before she could react, they tore at the seams, ripping the fabric, unraveling her dream before her eyes. They left her there, crumpled on the floor, their laughter ringing in her ears. She wept, truly wept, for the first time in years. A voice whispered through the dark. A woman appeared, draped in a veil that moved like smoke. She never gave her name, only a promise. You will have your night, child, but make it count. The gown that melted over Ella's skin was unlike any fabric she had ever known. Black silk that shimmered in the moonlight, cut to perfection. The glass slippers, cold as grave markers, sent a shiver through her bones as they fit snugly to her feet. With a whisper of wind, she was gone, carried to the palace in a carriage of shadows. The ball was a dream spun from gold and candlelight. Ella entered, every eye turning to her, but she had only one gaze to capture. Prince Aldric was striking, dressed in royal finery, but his face still bore the smirk of the boy who had once laughed at her father's death. She smiled sweetly as he took her hand, as if she had never seen him before. as if she were just another girl entranced by his charm. He fell for her like a moth to a flame, never suspecting the fire would consume him whole. When the clock struck midnight, she fled, leaving behind a single glass slipper. A lure, not a mistake. Aldrich's search for her was an ordeal. He sent out riders to every village, every manor, every humble dwelling, each day without finding her gnawed at him, the image of the mysterious beauty haunting his dreams. He interrogated nobles, questioned servants, demanded answers from the court mystics. The slipper remained a cruel token, a whisper of a love lost too soon. As days stretched into weeks, desperation took hold. He rode through the streets himself, through muddy alleys and cobblestone paths, ignoring his advisor's warnings that a prince should not lower himself so. He barely ate, barely slept, convinced that she was out there, waiting for him. When he finally arrived at the home of Lady Seraphina, his heart pounded with something dangerously close to hope. Seraphina, sensing what was to come, tried to keep Ella hidden. She locked her away in the attic, drawing the curtains, ordering the servants to keep silent. But fate, or something darker, intervened. Mice gnawed through the rope of the locked door, the wind blew open a shutter, and a whisper of inevitability seemed to drift through the halls. When Aldrich placed the slipper upon Lisette's and Margot's feet, it was as if the house itself held its breath. The glass refused them as expected, but just as he was about to turn away, a thought struck him. His gaze swept over the room, then landed on Seraphina. "Is there no one else in the house?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Seraphina hesitated, her fingers twitching at her sides. "No," she said too quickly. A soft creak echoed from the staircase. Heads turned as Ella appeared, descending slowly, the dim candlelight catching on the soot still clinging to her dress. Her face was unreadable, her steps slow, deliberate. The hush in the room deepened as she reached the final step, lifting her chin and meeting Aldrich's gaze. And when she looked at him with those wide, shimmering eyes, he thought himself the luckiest man alive. Ella's stepmother and stepsisters watched in stunned silence. But as she looked back, something inside her shifted. She would not leave them behind to rot. Not yet. "Come with me," she told them, offering a hand. "Let's start anew." Hesitant but desperate, they accepted. The weeks that followed were strange, almost serene. Ella played her role as the blushing bride-to-be, and to her own surprise, her stepmother and stepsisters began to change. Lisette and Margot softened, no longer speaking to her with barbed tongues. Seraphina, once a cold and cruel woman, spoke of regret, of love lost. For a moment, Ella almost believed in second chances. Almost. The wedding was a spectacle unlike any other. The kingdom rejoiced, the streets overflowing with banners and music. From dawn until dusk, celebrations filled the city. Fountains ran with honeyed wine, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and fresh flowers. Ella stood at the altar in a gown spun from moonlight, the fabric so fine it shimmered with every breath. Prince Aldrich, enraptured, took her hand and whispered words of devotion, his eyes alight with the promise of forever. The court cheered as they sealed their vows with a kiss, and for a fleeting moment, Ella allowed herself to bask in it. The illusion of happiness, the weight of a crown that had once belonged to her enemies, now resting upon her own head. Seraphina wept with pride. Lisette and Margot laughed with joy, spinning through the halls as they danced with suitors. It was everything a fairy tale should be, almost. Then the wedding night came. The grand halls of the palace were filled with laughter and wine. Nobles drank deep, unaware of the quiet shifting in the air, the unnatural hush settling over the corridors. The festivities carried on deep into the night, laughter echoing through the grand halls. Ella moved gracefully among the nobles, her smile warm, her voice soothing. She thanked her stepmother for her kindness, embraced her stepsisters as if they were truly dear to her. She sat beside Aldrich, feeding him honeyed fruit, gazing into his eyes as if he were her one true love. And then it began. It started with the guards. One by one, they stopped appearing at their posts. Then a servant found a trail of bloody footprints leading to an empty suit of armor. The knight inside vanished without a sound. Lisette and Margot were next. They were found in their chambers, floating in their own bathwater, their faces frozen in peaceful smiles. Seraphina's screams were heard last. When the guards broke down her door, they found her hanging from the chandelier, a look of terror twisted on her face. The terror unfolded like a slow-moving nightmare. The royal guards were found missing, their abandoned armor cold as though they had vanished hours before. A deep, suffocating silence settled over the castle, a stillness unnatural for a night of such joy. Servants disappeared without a trace, their final steps marked by smears of crimson along the marble floors. In the grand dining hall, the guests grew restless, their laughter turning into uneasy whispers. Ella only watched, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face a picture of gentle concern. When Aldrich asked if she was frightened, she took his hand and gave it a soft squeeze. "Not as long as you're here," she murmured. But as the screams began, echoing through the corridors like a chorus of the damned, Aldrich barely had time to process the horror before his body betrayed him. He collapsed, his limbs numb, his breath shallow. Poison. A slow, exquisite venom that burned through his veins like liquid fire. She bent down beside him, brushing a hand through his hair. "You never even recognized me," she whispered. "Not once." As the last of his breath left his lips, she stood. The room was silent. The palace was hers. She turned to the grand mirror behind the throne, looking at herself. A queen draped in black, her eyes like the void, her lips curled into something too knowing, too satisfied. Ella did not take the throne with cruelty. She took it with grace, with mourning. She wore black not as a symbol of power, but of sorrow, veiling her face as she stood before the grieving kingdom. She spoke of loss, of tragedy, of the horrors that had stolen her beloved husband and his family from her arms. She wept at the funeral, her tears falling softly upon Aldrich's golden casket, whispering prayers as the people cried with her. She was a queen who had suffered, a queen who understood pain. The kingdom loved her for it. And when she stood upon the palace balcony, looking down at the people who now adored her, trusting her to lead them through their sorrow, she turned away from their pleading eyes and smiled. Thank you for joining us in the world of Twilight Fables. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.